No, I've never seen it. So, thank you.
All right, turn it out.
Yeah, okay.
And Bill, it is a different computer than high school, but essentially the same process.
I still miss your perspective. He had genius. Everything was last.
I don't know.
Getting saved. Last 10 years interact a lot save our maintenance, save his did that always representing someplace positive.
So again, just when we start, I'm going to make eye contact with Jeff. Yep. I'm going to give him one of these, and you'll see him start to walk up. At that, you get change. Okay? All right.
There was about 15, 20 years. Antique stores are and double state unprecedented show. Inventory furniture decorators and art was the biggest thing in terms of that story and appreciating. It wasn't first or so we were all young. And His house and everything. He was just so, he was super. 71. I wouldn't want to. You got a little bit. Oh, I was scary. Chris Cox, and Hardy both died in 71. And nobody saw it. He was a little heavy.
1 Well, good evening, everyone. We want to welcome you to the second in our fall 2021 series of Hartford History Lectures, brought to you by Capital Community College's Hartford Heritage Project and the Historic Hartford Facebook group, as well as the Old State House, who is hosting us here in this beautiful building. And thank you. All right, thank you for coming out tonight. We have some Capital Community College students in the audience, and we have some professors from other colleges and people from the history community and people just interested in Hartford. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. And we also have people online. I want to thank everyone who's joining us online tonight. I want to let you know just a couple of housekeeping items. If you are online and you want to ask a question, there's a comments section on your that you can write your questions into. Just enter them there, and your question will be asked later during the Q&A time. For those of you here in the live audience, if you have a question, do raise your hand during the Q&A, and we ask that you wait until the microphone is brought to you so everybody online can hear and that we can get that on the recording as well. These broadcasts, these recordings will be available on the Connecticut's Old State House Facebook and YouTube channels, also at the Hartford Heritage Project website, which is part of the Capital Community College website. And I also want to announce, and also they will be broadcast on Connecticut Network as well. Finally, I just want to make sure everybody knows that we have a really exciting series. We're just into the second one now. We've got 2 more lectures coming up next week. Dr. Fiona Vernal of UConn is going to be, a history department, is going to be talking about shade tobacco stories, land, labor, and immigration in the Connecticut Tobacco Valley. So join us for that in person or online. The week after that, we have a Saturday, November 13th, tour that Bill Hosley will be leading at the Spring Grove Cemetery in Clay Arsenal in the north of Hartford. We will also be going into Faith Congregational Church and taking a tour of the church that is the oldest Black congregation in Hartford. And they have amazing history there to share with us. Their history committee is going to be doing that for us. And then finally, on November 18th, R.J. Luke Williams of Hartford Public High School's Archives is going to be talking about the history of that institution. So that should be fascinating. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and I want to welcome Bill Hosley.
Thank you, Jeff. God, I love working with these people. This is the best we've done this 4 years. It's the best series we've had yet, and the best team. And Fiona's going to be awesome. And Luke is what he's done at Hartford High, phenomenal. And I'm praying for no rain at Spring Grove because it's November, and you never know what you get. So I'm an architectural. One of the things I do is architectural history. I used to work at the Wadsworth Atheneum as a curator, and I love architecture and gravestones and art that you can look at outdoors without having to pay a ticket to see it. And there's a lot of it around. It's all pretty awesome. So a couple of years ago, when I was still working as a consultant, I had a job. It was one of the great projects I ever got to do, doing a hour-long presentation and research about Travelers Tower. It was their 100th anniversary, and that's a story unto itself. But I thought, well, I can do a whole thing on another building. And to me, the Connecticut State Capitol is one of the 10 most essential buildings in Connecticut. And so we'll get into that. A few years ago, we were traveling in Michigan, where we checked into a motel. They asked where we were from. When we said Hartford, the person checking us in said, "Oh, wow, that city has beautiful architecture." I thought, well, okay, yeah, of course. For all we've lost and for all the challenges ahead, that is still true. As early as the 1840s, author and naturalist Henry David Thoreau asked a simple question that is always timely and relevant. What are the features which make a town handsome? Hartford has been blessed by patrons, builders, architects who not only asked that question, they were determined to do something about it. Aware that the city's image and reputation were fundamental to its competitiveness, they insisted that its built environment telegraph its power and aspirations. Beginning, again, as a curator at Wadsworth Atheneum, in a city that is home to the Mark Twain House, I developed a strong interest in Victorian art. This is now 40 years ago when I was starting out at Wadsworth, and architecture. And I mounted exhibitions and developed tours that explored many facets of the Gilded Age when Hartford was one of the richest cities in America. As early as the 1850s, Connecticut, the only state with 2 alternating state houses. You know, nations formed and everybody says, well, we're going to put our capital in Harrisburg or Annapolis or Montpelier, Vermont. Connecticut refused to make that decision for 70, 80 years, and had outgrown both the state houses. The almost decade-long initiative to consolidate and build began in 1871. They commenced construction in 1874, and it was completed and occupied in 1879. It was the biggest construction project of its age and left us with an eye-popping architectural jewel, often ranked as the national favorite among all 50 club members that visit every capital. They're a whole subculture people, that's their hobby. They go to pick off the capitals, and they are always saying, oh my God, this one's amazing. Shown here with the State Library and Supreme Court and Museum of Connecticut history across the street. It's across the street. So high modern Gothic with its countless sculpture and ornamental flourishes, it is a work of art that lends itself to civic instruction. A towering confection of granite, marble, statuary, and a gold leaf dome. For those raised on modernism with its stark steel and glass office towers, all this ornament may be an acquired taste. But anyway, so yeah, this is some of the Victorian stuff, you know, tours and ways to call interest to it. Yeah, and this is the picture. The Capitol's on the left, lower left, and then the State Library, which is a museum, and also the Supreme Court is on the right. So, and school groups come there, and it's great. And again, eye-popping architectural details. We'll get more into that. Pretty breathtaking stuff, and it helps to have it's like bird watching. If you are really into bird watching, you got to have binoculars, you know, so you can spot the birds up high. And to really appreciate the Capitol, it almost helps to have binoculars, because a lot of the beauty of it is way up high, and you can see all this. Again, it may not be your taste, but it may not even be mine, but it's pretty amazing. And they were really, really stretching to make this thing what it is. The State House, our story begins with Charles Bulfinch and John Leffenwell's late 18th century neoclassical State House built of brick and brownstone, which we are in presently. And it's great. You know, there's so much going on here, and it's a miracle in many ways that this has been saved through all the years. As a museum, the Connecticut's old State House is certainly a Hartford treasure. The State House in New Haven, designed by Ithiel Town for New Haven in 1831, didn't fare so well, but for years was a defining feature, along with New Haven's 3 famous churches on the green. And these are that interior picture. I've only ever seen one, and probably most of you have never seen this, but I wish they documented it before they bulldozed it, but New Haven lost, and Hartford wound up with the Capitol. And that effort started a lot earlier than you might think. Talk about a new Capitol began in the 1850s with Sam Colt and his South Hartford faction going so far as to design a building for the site of the Charter Oak overlooking Colt's Armory in the South Meadows. That never got built, but that is 1858 and the beginnings of that. And then, of course, Bushnell Park is developed in the 50s and 60s. So there's a beginning sense of a cohesive downtown with some amenities like the park. And when the issue of where to place the Capitol came up, I only learned this in the course of this. It's amazing. One of the closest elections in Connecticut history was between these guys, election for governor, of Marshall Jewell on the left and New Haven's James English on the right. And it really, the big issue in that campaign was the capital. And New Haven, that's a whole nother program in itself, why New Haven never trusted Hartford and really might still not like us very much, but that's okay. Marshall Jewell won. And it goes back to this, Connecticut, what we know is Connecticut in the colonial period was actually 3, maybe 4, if you count New London. The New Haven colony, which included Greenwich, interestingly enough, is in tan there. And the Connecticut river towns, what they called Connecticut, the Connecticut colony, was along the river. It started in Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor. And by the way, the northeastern part of Long Island was part of Connecticut at one time, and then Mystic and New London. So this did not all come together right away. And little known today, but the 3 grapevines on the Connecticut state seal signify the unity of New Haven, Hartford, and the Saybrook, New London colonies. So this is part of the imagery of our state. This bird's eye view from 1869 is one of the great images, and it was really created to showcase Bushnell Park by the designer of Bushnell Park. And there's a copy of this at the Butler McCook House. I'm sure the Connecticut Historical Society has one. And it shows, it's like a portrait of the city at that moment. And you can see Bushnell Park in the foreground, but no Capitol. What you see on the lower right there is Trinity College. And Trinity College, as we'll see, was on the location of today's Capitol. And all of this becomes a much bigger deal. Trinity, and this also shows, this is 1877, so the Capitol has now been built just 10 years later. And actually, this picture was created 2 years before the Capitol was occupied. So they had an idea, maybe it was artistic license. You can see Bushnell Park there. Soldiers and Sailors Arch is not yet there. And this is what Trinity College looked like. Founded as Washington College by Episcopalians in 1824 and was a classic tripartite collegiate plan with a chapel in the center. And this is the state and city had to buy out and demolish this campus at a time when Trinity College was growing and prospering and needed more room anyway. They were given 5 years to build a new campus and relocate. They chose British Gothic revival architect William Burgess, shown on the right here, his only American project. And I love that picture in the center top. That shows their grandiose vision for Trinity. They didn't build all that. They got maybe a quarter of it done, but that was their little fantasy. And at that point, Trinity College had almost as many students as Yale, and none of these schools had even hundreds of students. They were much, much smaller, but that they moved, and you could do a whole lecture on the construction, the economics, the politics, the finances. I'm not going to go into that, but they embarked in someone could, again, write a dissertation on it, is beyond the scope of this, but I get the sense that New Haven interests were dragged kicking and screaming into the state funding the creation of this new capital. Hartford economic interests put up like a third of the money all by themselves. So that's how much they wanted it. This is a list of the commissioners that were involved in the overseeing the construction of the building. And in 1872, they embarked on a design competition that attracted a who's who of American architects at the time. A variety of public voices, noticeably Horace Bushnell and Frederick Law Olmsted, weighed in on matters of location and architectural style, probably the most extensive civic discussion of architecture and design in the city's history. Everyone realized this was going to be a game changer for Hartford's image. Local talent, the local guys were George Keller, who designed the Soldiers and Sailors Monument and many other things around Connecticut, and James Batterson, best known as the founder of Travelers. They were among those who submitted designs, and in the end, the Batterson firm got the contract to build it, but was not chosen as the designer, and there was that's a whole nother thing. Batterson was not pleased, and as he got more powerful, he was, I would say, a bit disruptive. but that's okay. They hired this guy. They were passed over by Richard Upjohn, son and partner with the renowned New York Gothic revivalist Richard Upjohn. And these, by the way, on the right is little screen save from the Hartford Current. I search the Hartford Current sometimes when I'm doing research, and it talks about him. And I think there's something in here where Batterson is complaining about the architect, and there was too much of that. In the State Library, across the street from the Capitol, they have all the records and all these architectural drawings, and you'll see a few in a moment, but they're really phenomenal visual information. And these are just some of the files in the State Library. I mean, it just, you could rebuild the building today with all the information. So I went over there, and I just tip of the iceberg, but I looked at some of the architectural designs, and the original Upjohn plan called for a clock tower, not a dome. And you can see on the right is what got built. On the left is, and I think Batterson had something to do with, like, forget the clock tower, let's do a dome. I like clock towers. I love the Keeney clock tower in the North End. There are clock towers in Sharon and Stockbridge. They're rare and they're cool, and it's a Victorian thing, and I love them. And these are just some of the really great details. And I'll get back to this later, but the picture on the left, if you look at the top, there is an iron railing, and we'll get back to this. The dome was designed with tourism in mind, and people used to go up there and loved it. And I've been up there. Well, we'll see. Anyway, they hired Randolph Rogers, who was a sculptor, whose first Hartford work was the figure of Gabriel, shown on the right here on the 1865 Colt Monument in Cedar Hill Cemetery. So there were lots of contractors and suppliers. There were also labor strikes. I mean, this was a huge project, and there were, I don't even understand half of it, but at some point, the stone cutters and workmen said 10 hours a day, too much. We want 9, and we're going on strike. And it was, you can search this in the Hartford Current online. It was a big, big deal, and lots of stuff written about that. And, one of the articles I read was saying that when they built the Richardson building, what we know as the Richardson building, originally the Cheney building, a lot more people were killed during the construction of the Capitol. We did pretty well. Only 4 died. But these are fatal accidents, and they talk about them. This poor guy fell through the dome and hit the floor below, and anybody who's been in the Capitol looking up, that might have hurt. And for the deaths during construction, largest construction project in the city's history. What we got was a sculpturally, richly ornamented masterpiece in what is called the modern Gothic style. On the south face, 3 of the 6 niches for statues were filled with the Connecticut luminaries from the then recent Civil War. The other 3 and the spandrels and bosses below were left empty, and we'll get back to that. And these are the 3. The figures were Lincoln's, from left to right, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, General Alfred Terry in the middle, who survived the war and distinguished himself in the later Indian Wars and was, among other things, involved in cleaning up the mess after Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn. And then on the right, General John Sedgwick from Cornwall, Connecticut. He led troops at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and Spotsylvania, where this is so, it's almost funny, it's funny. His famous last words were, "They couldn't hit an elephant at that distance." What better way for a class to learn history than gathering before this storied landmark, looking, learning, and telling stories? That's the south face. The north face is even more exciting to me and very difficult to photograph. There are only a couple weeks a year where the light, I won't go into it, but I love it. The north face gets better. It is here that the narrative power of the building is concentrated. No capital in the United States packs so much punch inside and out. Note the unfinished round bosses above the statues and on either side of the columns below. Note the sculpted arched spandrels, each with a Connecticut story to tell, and we'll get into that. this is a detail, to the degree to which the design of this building was saturated in state history, there is nothing quite like it. And yes, some of the history is no longer well known. Some perhaps is controversial, but we'll get into that. But the sense of purpose and the richness of detail is why Connecticut's capital belongs on any list, the 10 most significant buildings that we have. By the way, not lost on anyone at the time is that its design was in the English Gothic, which had distinct ecclesiastical overtones. This was Trinity Church across the street from Capital Community College, now known as Christ Church Cathedral, but it was called Trinity Church for years, an 1820s masterpiece commissioned as Hartford's Episcopalians were clawing their way to the top. And all that English Gothic, they talk about separation of church and state. Nobody was confused that these were Episcopalians driving this agenda. And whether you would do that today, who knows? But the statues on each side of the Capitol, figures from the colony's founding, from the nation's birth after the Revolutionary War and Civil War heroes already cited. These were all names any school child would have known in 1875. Governor Theophilus Eaton, the co-founder of the New Haven colony. Governor John Haynes was one of the founders of the Connecticut colony in Hartford and its first governor. He was on the committee that drafted the fundamental orders, the basis of Connecticut's claims as the first written constitution and the oldest continuous government by consent of the government in North America. That plaque on the left is in the ancient burying ground. Reverend Thomas Hooker of Hartford, father of the Connecticut colony, gave the sermon that inspired the first written constitution, champion of universal Christian suffrage. And if the word suffrage, it's women's suffrage, women's rights, women got the vote in 1920. Religion had the same issue long before. And, do the laity, the members of the parish have a right to influence church policy? And Connecticut was on the vanguard of championing that kind of freedom. Roger Ludlow of Windsor and Norwalk, the monument on the right in Norwalk, shows him, but he started out here, and he was English legal training. He was involved in shaping the fundamental orders. And then there's Joseph Wadsworth, who famously hid the Connecticut's royal charter in the cavity of a great oak at a period of political turmoil in the 1660s. So, and then Reverend John Davenport, a Puritan clergyman and founder of the New Haven colony. So these are some of the figures on the Capitol. And then Governor John Winthrop of New London, governor of the Connecticut colony, who orchestrated the merger of New Haven, Saybrook, and New London into a unified colony. And I don't think the New Haven interests have ever entirely forgiven him. But there you have it. And that's John Winthrop. He's up there. And now the controversial Captain John Mason, the commanding officer in the Pequot War of 1638. From Windsor and the founder of Norwich, he obtained the charter that unified Connecticut and New Haven, and again founded New London in 1645. And there's a figure of him, we'll get back to that, on the Capitol. There's a statue of him in Windsor that is, every school child would have known these names. On the east and west face of the Capitol are figures from the American Revolution. Governor John Trumbull from Lebanon, where his gravesite was an early Connecticut tourism attraction, and where his house is operated as a museum by the Daughters of the American Revolution in Lebanon. And that statue on the left is the same one as the one on the Capitol here on the right, and it's actually in the United States Capitol. That's a whole story. There are two of them. And then David Humphreys, Yale-educated soldier, politician, entrepreneur, General Washington's aide-de-camp at Yorktown, who famously delivered the British flag of surrender to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And then Roger Sherman, the only founding father who signed all three founding documents: the Articles of Confederation, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution. He was a member of the first United States Congress, a treasurer at Yale College, and he's also I've never gotten to the bottom of why. Celebrated in stone in the New York State Capitol. That's on the upper left there. There's Roger. He must have spent some time in New York too, but there he is, Roger Sherman. Brigadier General David Wooster, the highest ranking Connecticut general in the Revolutionary War, who was killed at the Battle of Ridgefield in 1777, and whose monument in Danbury is shown on the right. Maybe the stonecutters were on strike that day because his name was never carved on the base of the statue like all the rest. But this is the figure of Chief Justice Oliver Ellsworth, who was a member of the first U.S. Senate elected in 1789 and the third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he's on the Capitol as well. Oliver Wolcott, Washington Secretary of the Treasury, commemorated in stone in a building at Yale, shown on the upper left there. I mean, these, again, we used to teach, well, we had less history to squeeze into the curriculum, I guess. So they got, eventually they'll forget about us too. But, you know, these were all household names in the 19th century. Then there are the bosses, the little round unfinished figures that you see here, the little round sections of marble meant for figural busts of other Connecticut worthies, many never finished and waiting to be stamped with the impressions of future generations. And you can see a couple there on the lower right. Among the figures immortalized in stone on the Capitol are Noah Webster on the left and the Reverend Horace Bushnell, who lived to see the building underway but did not live long enough. He died, I think, in 1876, so it wasn't finished when he was gone. Boy, was he revered. Horace Bushnell, people go, who was he? What was he? He was a minister, what? He was a public intellectual. He was somebody who weighed in on every issue of the day. And communities need those people. And there are things that he stood for and against we might not agree with, but he filled a huge role. This is a little more obscure. Poet and statesman Joel Barlow, less well known today. The figure on the right is in the collection of the Wadsworth Athenaeum, probably not exhibited in 100 years, but still there. He was an ardent Jeffersonian who supported the French Revolution. So someday one could probably write a dissertation on him. But there he is on the Capitol. And Jonathan Edwards, East Windsor born and raised, Yale educated, Great Awakening cleric. He and Benjamin Franklin were the two most famous Americans on the eve of the American Revolution. They had international reputations, and his influence in American religious life is giant. I mean, he's really interesting person. And then son of Revolutionary War governor, the artist and founder of the Yale Art Gallery, John Trumbull, whose epic history paintings grace the walls of the Wadsworth Athenaeum and the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. Famous signing of the Declaration of Independence. Great, great stuff. This one is weird, and I still don't get it, and I still don't get him, and I apologize if my scholarship isn't much deeper than Wikipedia these days, but I had to do a lot of stuff to get this ready. The Anglo-Irish philosopher, Bishop George Berkeley, who resided for a few years in Rhode Island. He was basically a Brit. What's he doing on Connecticut's capital? Why? He was an early and major benefactor of Yale, and I think a lot of the politics of these figures is throwing bones to New Haven, where the Berkeley Divinity School is still an Episcopal seminary embedded within the Yale Divinity. A little puzzling, but interesting, and great stuff. Then there are the Spanrels. These are the arts sections, each of which with a story to tell. Every culture, nation, and tribe, human societies want and need origin stories that sometimes seem almost mythological. Connecticut's are told on these Spanrels with careful balance given to the different subregions, independent colonies that came together in the late 17th century as Connecticut. And one of the Spanrels has our beloved state seal and motto, and it's in the center. But here are the others. Thomas Hooker's March to Hartford, a scene also depicted by the artist Frederick Church in a painting that is at the Athenaeum. There is William Holmes and the Plymouth Massachusetts migrants skirting north past the Dutch fort to settle Windsor in 1633. For years, Windsor and Wethersfield duked it out which town was earliest. I met Linda McMahon at one point when she was running for governor or whatever it was, and I had a little conversation with her. I said, could we get the what is it, the WNA, the World Wrestling? And that's her thing, Vince McMahon, World Wrestling. I said, we should just end this for all. We'll get one guy be Windsor, one guy be Wethersfield, and once the one loses, we'll stop arguing about it. There we go. Me too. And look, she thought it was funny. I got a laugh out of her. Anyway, but this was that story. Windsor always claims it. And then this is Reverend Davenport preaching the first sermon under the oak in New Haven. This is part of the New Haven mythology, and some of it is undoubtedly true. Then there's another spandrel that illustrates the Pequot War, whereby the New England settlements were secured, some will argue, from obliteration by the May 26th pre-dawn massacre on the Pequot Fort, effectively eliminating the Pequot tribe as a viable threat. It's part of Connecticut's origin story, and a close reading of the Wikipedia entry, you don't have to go much farther than that, or any of a number of 19th and 20th century history or encyclopedias, provides far more context than anybody who's weighed in on this issue has read or knows. I'm just saying that, and you may not agree with me, but I'll get to a punchline eventually. The story of the charter oak pops up twice, both in the representation of the tree and a spandrel illustrating Captain Joseph Wadsworth in the act of hiding the Connecticut 1662 charter in the tree in 1687. That's 1687 was when the episode took place with the oak, to defend Connecticut's independence. And I mean, these are wonderful sculptural representations. And then finally, the story every school child used to know about General Israel Putnam caught plowing his fields in Pomfret, Connecticut, when he heard the news of the Lexington alarm, dropped his plow, and dashed off to command Connecticut troops, playing a major role at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was one of Rogers' Rangers during the French and Indian War. Putnam was Connecticut's highest ranking military officer at the outset of the American Revolution. Statuary in the grounds of the Capitol. This figure of Bishop Thomas Brownell was the first bronze statue erected in Hartford. He was the founder of Trinity College and this statue occupied the Capitol grounds until it was relocated to the new campus. And there are pictures of it in situ in the Capitol, but just showing what was there. And then there's Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton by Hartford sculptor Enoch Woods. He was Nathan Hale's commanding officer and the leader of Knowlton's Rangers, killed at the Battle of Harlem Heights. And I've been there. I mean, there's a lot of Rev War history in New York City. You wouldn't know most times you visit, but if you look for it, it's there. Battle of Harlem Heights, as Washington, and the Continental troops beat a hasty retreat from New York City in 1776, the darkest year in the history of the American Revolution. We really could have gone down for the count. Considered America's first intelligence professional. Up upper right there is a picture of the sculptor. He was a Hartford-based sculptor, and he did Thomas Knowlton and a few other things. Then there are statues left to right of Governor Richard Hubbard, Major General Clarence Edwards from World War I, this left to right. The Andersonville boy, and if you know about your Civil War history, and Matt Warshower has forgotten more than I ever knew about it. It's painful. Andersonville was just insane. It was like the Southern prison camp, and more than half the prisoners died, and the books have been written about it. It's awful. And so the Anderson boil is an emotional tribute to the young boys, many of them, 15, 16 years old, who died in prison, in a Southern prison. And then on the far right, we'll hear more about him, is Israel Putnam. And then inside the foyer, it's outside the Capitol, but it's covered by a roof, are the relief sculptures of Civil War General Joseph Hawley, who was later a governor, later a U.S. senator, was the commissioner in the Congress that oversaw the development of the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. I love that stuff. And he was the most famous orator on the Civil War. You know, anytime there was a dedication, they hauled out Governor Hawley. He had a golden tongue, and he was there. He was a general in the Civil War, and you couldn't get elected to high office in the 1870s during the Gilded Age if you hadn't served in the American Revolution, preferably, the American Civil War, preferably in a distinguished way. I am not sure why Orville Platt is on the other side, a U.S. senator, an influential Republican senator associated with Litchfield and Meriden. I did not drill down. Somewhere in my house, I've got a book about him, a biography I've never read someday. But these are beautiful works of art and produced by the Gorham Foundry in Providence. And I won't go into long detail about that. This is hard to, if I were Trinity College, I would want this properly lit. It's very hard to see, but it's the plaque on the Capitol commemorating Trinity College's history there. And I used to take Trinity College alumni groups and parents' weekend groups on bus tours, and we'd go there, walk around, and they'd all get very excited when they'd see the Capitol. Okay, so let's go inside where everything from the doorknobs to the carpets epitomize Gilded Age aesthetics and excess. So many of the products and materials were made in Connecticut. The Capitol was designed so that most of the first floor is ceremonial and symbolic. And even the doorknobs have the Connecticut state seal on them. Wonderful ceramics in the governor's office and fireplaces. And Secretary of State Denise Merrill, I had a bus tour we did, a Civil War treasure troves, and we were all set to go to the Capitol. I had no idea it was closed on Saturday, learned about 4 days in advance, and we arranged this whole thing. Anyway, she came in because we would have had to spend $40,000 to hire security for an hour otherwise. And she opened the Capitol for us and was a great host. People went in her office. It was great. Anyway, ceramic tiles. This is so cool. This is a water cooler on the upstairs that was donated and was probably the finest thing they ever made by Simpson, Hall, and Miller, a electro silver plating company in Wallingford. And it's great. The woodwork, almost everywhere you look, oak, birch, maple woodwork, lots of, this is Victorian stuff. It's aesthetic movement, modern Gothic. If you know the Goodwin reception room at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, it's of the same period. And this was Hartford's economic boom era. Carpeting from the Hartford Carpet Company, which was actually in Enfield, but neither here nor there. Articles about the carpet. And they're so proud of the fact that they were building this thing. A lot of it was Connecticut stone. A lot of the materials made that were used were made here. And Connecticut dominated the brass chandelier industry. And while there's probably a record in the voluminous papers at the State Library, I don't know that these were Connecticut made, but I'll bet dimes to dollars they were. And they're, again, high Victorian. Stenciling and fresco work. This is the House chamber and the Senate chamber, which, when they're in session, you can sort of sneak in. And when they're not in session, the doors are locked. So I've never properly photographed these rooms. And in the Senate chamber is a chair made in 1857 out of wood from the charter oak. And I think the lieutenant governor, when there's a tie to break, sits in that chair, and I'm not sure all the details, but it's a very cool thing. There are 2 charter oak chairs in Hartford, that one and the one at Wadsworth Athenaeum that Sam Colt commissioned. And as mentioned, stained glass, a Boston firm was commissioned to do that. The fresco work, huge restoration in the early 1980s, where a lot of this, John Canning, who's a legend, did a lot of the restoration work of the fresco work. And I never saw the Capitol before that. But polished granite columns, James Batterson perfected the technology of how you take a piece of granite and get it to sparkle. The Church of the Good Shepherd and the Parish House, I think both have, the Colt Memorial House, both have examples of that. It's really beautiful, cool stuff. And then carved marble and granite, again, some of it from Connecticut quarries, a lot of richly decorated features, allegorical figures. These are inside upstairs. We'll talk more about. I don't know what the subject matter on these ones is, but they're great. And then the Genius of Connecticut. Originally, the design was for this huge statue designed by Randolph Rogers, the sculptor, that for 50 years was at the top of the dome. And then after the hurricane, I forget the details, but 1938, they worried that she was going to crash and down on the ground and kill somebody. So they brought her indoors, and she's known as the Genius of Connecticut, Randolph Rogers, and she's inside. She's great. The dome. And I always, when I go in there, even when I've taken groups in there, I will lie on the floor under the dome and point my camera up. It's like a kaleidoscope. It's so beautiful. Then much of the first floor is devoted to display and memorials. Nathan Hale is on one end. The Governor Hubbard, whose statue is outside, when he was lobbying for the funding to commission this statue, he wrote, I love this, I often repeat it, a people who forget their defenders in the past will lack and deserve to lack defenders in the future. Connecticut, Nathan Hale's Connecticut state hero is an icon of probity, self-sacrifice, and moral courage. Probity, good word. On the right, lower right, is the other statue of Nathan Hale in Hartford, and it is in front of the Wadsworth Athenaeum. And they recently did a state-of-the-art restoration of that statue. And, when I think of the gushers of money our government spends on this, that, and the other thing, all of the outdoor statues at the Capitol, you can't leave these things for 100 years tarnishing in the outdoors without doing an occasional restoration, and they all need it, and I hope that will get done. And then there's other just great stuff, Civil War plaques and artifacts. My friend Dean Nelson, Museum of Connecticut History, insists that this cannonball embedded in a tree from the Battle of Chickamauga outside of losing my mind, Tennessee, Chattanooga, is a fake. that isn't, anyway, who knows? And there's a plaque to Ulysses Grant, whose ancestry was all in Connecticut. And the DAR put up a little plaque about the three men, Samuel Johnson, Roger Sherman, and Oliver Ellsworth, who were at the federal convention that framed our Constitution in 1787. So it's just loaded with history. There's also the USS Hartford. The prow of the ship is in the Capitol. The first work of art commissioned by the trustees of the Wadsworth Athenaeum. And this was paid for by subscriptions, school children contributing money, is that painting of the Battle of Mobile Bay that's at Wadsworth Athenaeum. And it was the most expensive picture the Athenaeum bought before 1930. And this Admiral Farragut, Mobile Bay, and the USS Hartford were really important stories that every resident in the city once knew. War dead. I mean, the 600, I don't know what the number is. Matt, can you help me out? What do they say the number of dead in the Civil War? 750 died. That does not include people who were maimed, wounded, may have died later. Unbelievable. And we can't, when we weep and moan about X, Y, or Z, you can't even begin to imagine the emotional, psychic, mental anguish and trauma this country went through over that war. It is staggering. And, just, and I won't get into this, but Ken Burns did the Civil War series. I'm sure most of you have seen it. And that really moved me. It was at that point I thought, why did I go into museum work? I wish I'd made documentary films because it's a cool thing. And he made it. And so we started going to battlefield sites, which is a national park, has like 50 Civil War battlefield sites. And every one of them is superbly operated. And you learn so much. And we haven't been everywhere, but we've been as far as Vicksburg and Spotsylvania and Shiloh and, the easy ones like Fredericksburg and Gettysburg. And they're really, really great. So what happens? After the Civil War, everybody was putting up Civil War monuments. And when public buildings were going up, and this shows two, one in Windsor Locks and the other in Rockville, that were called memorial halls. And in fact, I argue that our state capitol, first and foremost, was conceived and designed as a memorial hall. Yes, it had the functional duties to provide meeting space for representatives and office for the governor and etc. But the whole ground floor was dedicated to this historicizing process. And that's what they had in mind. And there's incredible news stories. I mean, some of the early stories before the Capitol was built, they were talking about they used the word museum to turn the Capitol into a museum, and with a picture gallery. That article on the left, if this goes up on YouTube, you can stop and read the whole thing at some point. But picture galleries were a big deal. Elizabeth Colt had, Wadsworth Athenaeum had a lot of art. Elizabeth Colt had more. And in 1867, when General Philip Sheridan visited Hartford, his first thing he wanted to do was see Mrs. Colt and see her art gallery. And a lot of rich people had these private art galleries. Why? Because there weren't art museums at that time. But there was a huge growing interest in public art and the things that art can do. So that's what they had in mind for the Capitol. The State Arsenal was in the North End, across from Old North Cemetery, not far from Faith Congregational and Spring Grove. And this is where the battle flag, the regimental flags, and all the things that the State Armory did or does were concentrated in this building, which was demolished long ago, probably about 1910. And this was the biggest event in the history of this city and the biggest event of the 19th century. It was September 17th, 1879. And the Capitol had just been finished. And it was called Battle Flag Day, the anniversary of the Battle of Antietam, one of the great events in the 19th century, the anniversary of the great battle that devoured, this is from their words, devoured thousands of Connecticut soldiers. The population of Hartford doubled that weekend. Over 100,000 visitors and veterans encamped in Bushnell Park, shown on the left there, very rare photograph, to witness the dedication, installation of the frayed and torn war flags inside the, quote, magnificent capital of our Commonwealth. So this was the event commemorating the transferal of these battle flags. And here we are. Rebecca, have you ever seen that picture on the lower right? That is during Battle Flag Day. This is the old State House. And that was a little crowd gathered outside. Pretty amazing. And all these pictures show the cities, you know, all up and down Main Street, decoration and, you know, just amazing stuff. So they installed the battle flags in this fabulous space in the Capitol, which I always love taking tour groups there because they just, you know, I'm not sure, every state, there are a few of these Civil War regimental flags that survive, but I think Connecticut has the largest collection of them. I'm not sure, but they were preserved and conserved and lovingly cared for and displayed. And each one has a story to tell. And I'm sure Matt Warschauer and others who know a lot more, again, about Civil War history than me, every one of these regiments you can Google, you can find out what battles they were in, what they did. And the emotion, again, the 700,000 deaths and the men and maimed and wounded on crutches day after day, week after week, that you would bump into everywhere. It was enveloping. Lost more, help me out on this, lost more soldiers at the Battle of Antietam than have been lost in all the wars combined since World War II. The U.S., is that possible? 23,000. No, more in Vietnam. Yeah, 23,000 killed in 12. It's just stunning. So, and there are other little cool artifacts. This is the first light battery in Hotchkiss revolving. There's a Hotchkiss revolving cannon in the Capitol. I don't think it's loaded. Alec Baldwin, stay away. But great artifacts. And this is Battle Flag Hall as it looked before what I'm about to show. And a picture of it from a 19th century book. Israel Putnam's gravestone was such a tourist attraction. It's amazing to put your mindset in theirs, that his gravestone out in Pomfret, people began showing up and they'd visit it and carve their initials in it. So to save it, they removed it. It's been in the Capitol for at least 100 years. That's his, and a reproduction of it is out there, but this was not removed from its original site yesterday. It was over in the 19th century that it was removed. And then there's the Marquis de Lafayette's camp bed. I'm not sure where that came from or how it's there, but it's on display there. There's also a statue just outside, within snowball throwing distance of the Capitol, of Lafayette. These were the Rev War iconic heroes. My favorite artifact on earth. I love this thing. This is an illuminated manuscript framed in wood made from the charter oak that Emily Holcomb, shown on the lower left there, persuaded Elizabeth Colt to donate to her cause, because Elizabeth Colt had lots of oak. And it won't go into that. But anyway, this was designed and sculpted by Albert Entris, who was a Hartford sculptor. And she commissioned this as part of an effort to rebrand Connecticut as the Constitution state at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. And it's because of Emily that our license plates show the Constitution state. And whether purist historians would agree with this or not, Connecticut's big attempt, claim was it was the first written constitution known to history that created a government. And, we'd like to think that the oldest continuous government by consent of the government written Constitution going back to Charter Oak. We did not surrender our rights as some of the other colonies did when England started clamping down on these little. Now, I always joke about Connecticut was so small and insignificant, it wasn't worth fighting over. And so we got to keep electing our governors, stuff like that. And it's pretty cool. And the wood carving is incredible. Then the Capitol has inspired photographers and artists. I'd love to do an exhibit, a competition where people would get a photo safari, get a bunch of people out there taking pictures. It's so darn picturesque, and there's so many vantage points. Photographers, artists. That picture on the left is a huge painting at the New Britain Museum that I like. These are just some other artists that have painted the Capitol in situ. Printmakers and popular art. That print on the lower left actually shows the Cheney block, the Richardson building, the original covered bridge across the Connecticut River in the foreground. But you can see the Capitol on the right. This was done about 1881. And the postcards, when Rebecca and I were at the Landmark Society, we were Connecticut Landmarks, we secured the donation of the greatest postcard collection on earth. This guy was a genius. I won't go into it, but there are hundreds, thousands of postcards. In the postcard era, these were hundreds, thousands perhaps of photographers who, in the period between about 1906 and 1920, documented the world on the eve of the automobile age. So they captured a lot of stuff that we don't see today, like the Park River going right through the Capitol. And then there are just little souvenirs. And the Capitol building always looms large in some of that kind of stuff. So artistically and aesthetically, the Capitol is a feast, again, for the eyes. This is the dome. And way up at the top, as I mentioned, you can see on the left is a little iron rail. It was designed with tourism in mind. And some years ago, we were in Kansas, and they do dome tours there. And my wife, is agoraphobic a word? I forget. But she doesn't like heights, so she wouldn't go. But I went. And you get up there, and it's just a little narrow staircase. You look down, it's like 150 feet. But boy, is that cool to be up there. And this is, again, I get a better picture. This is that gorgeous little iron staircase in the Capitol that you have to, that's the last trip. That's the last stage of the trip up. And I got permission to go up there once upon a time, some years ago, and it's pretty cool looking down, at the allegorical figures and the gold leaf. And these are pictures I took from up there. And these are pictures that, I guess I've got Kansas in the upper right and in the lower. I took that picture on the lower left from the dome of the Kansas Capitol. But on the upper left and the lower right are pictures taken from the dome of the Connecticut Capitol, and that postcard says, "View of Hartford, Connecticut from Capitol Dome." And what that tells you, I would almost say, of course, is that people did this and were welcome to do this. And I'm not suggesting we'll ever see that age again. But you know, tourism matters. People who follow what I do know that this has been my crusade. I'm 66 years old, so at this point I'm running out of time. I would like to live long enough to participate in a conversation in this city about how we can grow this industry. Why does it matter? Jobs, sustainability of cultural attractions, national reputation. We aren't doing a thing to promote tourism to the capital city. And I could write a book on why, though you can go on my YouTube channel and I've got something there. Anyway, people do go to the Capitol. And yeah, I did this thing. Why, getting from now to why tourism matters on my YouTube channel. And I've tried to make this argument. My friend, the late Bill Foudy, was also a champion of tourism. He was the director of the old State House here. He also really played a major role in saving the Mark Twain House. So I miss him many days. And I've written op-eds on the subject, and I've never had a member of the political class even one time respond to anything. So we don't know if they read or read me. They probably don't do either. Who knows? I should be nice. We actually had a mayoral forum at the Church of the Good Shepherd during 2 elections ago for the candidates. And Will Wilkins and Ken Kahn, former art council director, we organized this thing. We wanted candidates for mayor of Hartford to talk about culture and tourism. Not complicated. They all make a go of it, but nothing's happened since, and I won't go into that. But it should happen. And just to give you an example, this is Annapolis, Maryland. Yet even before COVID, Connecticut's capital was one of the very few in the U.S. closed to visitation both days of the weekend. Most capitals have at least a few hours on the weekend when tourists get around, when they're open, because they realize that people like to see these things. In Maryland, their capital, I don't know about COVID, but before I took these pictures, opened 9 to 5 both days and has gone to great lengths to make it a destination quality experience. Annapolis, a city 1/3 the size of Hartford, with less invested in cultural attractions, is a delight and does 5 times our tourism visitation. So I would say there's an opportunity there. But alas, after 9/11, the security industrial complex, as I call it, went wild with expansion. Is this necessary? For decades, the Capitol Police were present, adequate, and not intrusive. Several capitals I've visited in recent years do not impose this on visitors. Plopping it down in Battlefield Flag Hall, I will refrain from my off-color analogy, but it is appalling overkill that, in my view, sends a terrible message. That they could at least move it to the south entrance, where state employees breeze in and out, but not the poor tourists and taxpayers. I no longer bring groups there because of this. It's just, you have to take off your shoes and your pants and your belt or whatever they do. It's forgive me. It's awful. And I brought the last tour group I brought to the Capitol was a group of Chinese scholars who a professor from Trinity had invited here. And he wanted me to show them around Hartford. And excuse me, but they might have felt right at home trying to enter the Capitol. Anyway, I don't like it, all right? So there you go. The latest assault on this treasure is the proposed removal of the John Mason statue, who is offensive to the BLM movement. I don't know about you, but I regard vandalism of public property as a crime that should be rigorously punished. It should not be the way we solve problems. These monument removals rarely result from reasoned debate. It's an assault on history, which, by the way, is too rarely emphasized in our schools in what is supposed to be a self-governing nation. Ignorance of history and civics as a matter of public policy, how does that work exactly? It is demoralizing, a word invented, by the way, by Noah Webster. The General Assembly's call for removing the statue of Captain Mason needs further discussion. The idea that we can't have a serious adult conversation about it ought to offend everyone who has ever stood up for anything that wasn't popular in a moment of emotional frenzy. I'm not saying there aren't issues on both sides. I am insisting that we've never had an adult conversation about it. The exterior of the Capitol includes a program of historical commemoration with 80 spaces for sculptural representation of individuals and events from Connecticut's past. Only 32 of those 80 have ever been completed, including most recently a full length of Governor Ella Grasso. The rest have never been filled, leaving plenty of room for additional commemorations if that's what's wanted. Small efforts have been made with this newest statue of Prudence Crandall inside the Capitol. A recent discussion on social media came up with a list of future prospects. They're saying, well, who would you put on the Capitol now? Including Frederick Law Olmsted, Claire Booth Luce, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Elizabeth Colt, Igor Sikorsky, Wallace Stevens, Frederick Rensler, Paul Robeson, Paul Newman, Venture Smith, Uncas, John Brown, Constance Motley, Jordan Freeman, James Pennington, Frederick Church, Emily Holcomb, and Eliphalet Chapin. I would add to that Catherine Day, Father Michael McGivney, and Depression-era Governor Wilbur Cross. Names not popular today? Google them. They are part of our social fabric of accomplishment. And one of my favorite, lower left there, Catherine Day deserves 10 statues. Topic for another day. One suggested finishing the Spanrels with images representing our best qualities such as agriculture, commerce, insurance, scholarship, and other positive attributes of the state that support our economy and create our environment. I would add to that manufacturing, religion, education, and the epic arsenal of democracy, provisioning every war from the American Revolution to World War II. Connecticut was a place filled with makers. The point is to be thoughtful and additive, not canceling and subtractive. Or we could do like they do on the grounds of the State House in South Carolina with this outstanding narrative sculpture honoring and acknowledging the blight of slavery. Or on the grounds of the Capitol in Virginia, where the subject is civil rights. The other day, the Hartford Courant had this story about the dedication of a monument to Black soldiers in Franklin, Tennessee. I love this building. People protect what they love. Love only comes from familiarity. I'm trying to inspire us to take a closer look. The Connecticut Capitol is an extraordinary work of art. More than any other Capitol building, it radiates Gilded Age excess and historical expression. There isn't a better platform for teaching our state's history. Architecture, unlike paintings and statuary, is subject to remodeling, which rarely leaves well enough alone. I am opposed to removing the statue of Captain Mason. It desecrates a landmark and it erases an aspect of our history better talked about than erased. I'm sure some here won't agree. Decisions made in haste without discussion or debate are more likely to engender animosity and recrimination than to solve real problems. Agree, disagree, but by all means argue and debate. The freedom to do that is what makes America great. So I think I'm done. By all means, love Hartford. It houses more of our dreams, accomplishments, and glories than any other city or town. It is essential to telegraphing Connecticut's image here and beyond. We have an illustrious past, a challenging present, and a future as great and inspiring as we care to make it. So that's it. There are refreshments. I know there's going to be some Q&A, and I hope I didn't go too long. Anyone? Yeah.
Bill, we have somebody watching online on Connecticut's Old State House YouTube channel, and they have a question, and you touched upon this in one of your last slides, but maybe you care to comment more. And the question is, have there been any talks or plans to fill the empty statue and bust holders in the Capitol with newer historical figures?
I don't think any at all, not certainly since Ella Grasso. And my guess, I've never studied this, a lot of the stuff I showed was not done in 1879 when the Capitol opened. In fact, even some of the Spanrels were still being finished in like 1911. But I don't think since World War I, there was any discussion. And every single proposal was either going to be a Democrat or a Republican. And so I think that sometimes getting the funding, and let's be honest, to put a statue in one of those niches that would be of the character, quality, and scale of what's already there, that's probably $100,000 each, more. And so, I mean, I don't think there has been. I would like to see, I mean, if this program got out there and there was actually that discussion, and anybody in the General Assembly said, gee, that's not a stupid idea, let's talk about it, I would feel like I'd never had an experience like that in my life, where something I did actually started a process of discussion. Yeah.
We have another question coming from online from our friend Don Rogers, who's asking, was it customary among other state capitals to commemorate so much of state's history? Why did builders of Connecticut's capital devote so much attention to a who's who of state history?
Really good question.
What was the point?
Yeah, really good question. And the 50 Club that go to all the capitals, I don't want it, I don't need it, but I never go anywhere if there's a capital without making a little time to see it. So I've been to 20, and all of them have historical and some amazing paintings that you'll see in various places, more paintings than sculpture. But all of them do history, do state history to some degree. I've been in New York fairly recently. I think part of what we're looking at here is almost to the day mirrors what was going on in the art world and architectural world in that moment. So that by 1920, less likely to be that sculptural. But any thoughts anybody has? Why would Connecticut go? Forgive me, but a state that I don't regard. I think that on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being just almost obsessive historical consciousness, and 1 being total indifference, I would give. God, I'm going to be in trouble. I'd give Connecticut maybe a 3 or a 4. We don't embrace this stuff that well, but we did. And obviously everything in the papers, everything tells you. And some of that, Connecticut was almost history obsessed from the time of the Civil War to the Depression. And there are a lot of issues behind that. Some of it has to do with immigration and nativism, and there's all kinds of negative and positive aspects of it. But I don't think the absence of history is a positive. I think, to be conscious of where a place and to grapple with these things in a public way is always good. Yeah, yes.
Oh. Bill.
Yeah.
If you're part of the majority of the people who live in Hartford, and we go through your presentation from last week and this week, and we get to see a few Black people, and you end with this guy drawing something about loving Hartford. How are we gonna do how are we going to do this program? How are we going to promote Hartford and make the people who live here now feel like all of that majesty of colonial history?
Yes.
It is majestic. The architecture is splendid. It's beautiful. But how are we going to make people feel like it's their history? And that it's relevant to them if they really don't see themselves in it?
I get it. And I think I tried with that collage of pictures, and that, this, Fiona, was kind of amazing, because it's one of the reasons I kind of like Facebook. You'll post something, and sometimes you get a seminar. and these amazing threads of conversation that are never happening in the Hartford Current, for example, almost never. I mean, and so I raised this issue a couple of years ago and got all of these suggestions. And I think a third of the names that I named were people of color. So there are opportunities there. I think the monuments that I showed from South Carolina and Virginia suggest other opportunities. And I think if one of our Black leaders were to champion this issue, we would totally get there, because everybody understands what you're referring to, that sense of inclusion and diversity that hadn't been there, and the kind of lopsided way we tell history. But monuments, statues, commemoration, memory does not happen by accident. And one of the many reasons I am so grateful for what you do is, unlike anyone before you in this city, you are turning the page on scholarship about things that, I spent years trying to get the other cemetery that I love. I poked around, St. Patrick's. And Hartford has this amazing Catholic city. I think Connecticut is more Catholic than Protestant today. And I think, is it the Irish or the Italians that are the leading number one cultural group? Do you know, Matt? Irish? So there's a ton of Catholic history here. And I went to the Catholic archives at the diocese and at the cathedral, and they've got lots of stuff, but you don't, documentation doesn't interpret itself. You need human agency, people who are going to do the work and tell these stories. And I would love to, I don't have to do it. I'd love somebody to be able to give a tour of St. Patrick's Cemetery, but I have yet to find anyone interested enough and knowledgeable enough to even start. And maybe we'll get there, but and so I don't know. I just think I would love to see something additive, and I really wouldn't mind seeing the niches filled. Yes.
I'd like to pick up Fiona's question there, because at Capital Community College, when we walk in the back entrance of the building, we walk right past the corner of Market and Talcott Street, the site where the Talcott Congregational Church once stood. And this is such an important landmark, which has not been marked. It's basically, you could say it's been erased, or it's just never been recognized.
Yep.
By the city and taught in the schools and so forth. But it's a community in the early 19th century of 400 Black people who created this church, started this church, and started a school. The first Black church in Hartford, the first Black school in Hartford. And remarkable people. You had a picture of James Pennington up there, and you mentioned him as somebody who could go up on the Capitol building. And James Pennington was a pastor there for a good 12 years, and internationally known as a Black abolitionist. Remarkable story. James Mars was a deacon there, wrote his own story of how he was born as a slave in Connecticut. He was enslaved here. And Plato, we could go on. There's so many people there that we have a history of, but it's not taught, it's not remembered, it's not marked, and these things need to change. It's not to say that all of the history of other ethnicities and of white people is not important, but it means that we have work to do.
I think it's clear, and it would be, I would love, look, the governor has created, I think, I don't know what, there's some kind of a commission that is going to grapple with the statue removal issue. And I don't care if it's me, but I want somebody with historical consciousness on that committee, because you can't get there without some degree of historical consciousness.
So Bill, I have sort of two different questions that stem from the same idea. I think cities and states, much like individuals, don't necessarily think about meaning and commemoration unless there's some milestone, some event that gives us an opportunity to reflect. Right. So one of the things that many of us, in this room and around the state did a number of years ago for the Civil War commemoration is we used that 150th anniversary as a springboard to learn as much as we could across the state and create communities to discuss these things. And we literally did more research and more uncovering of information
Than the 100 years prior combined.
than any time since the American Civil War.
Yeah.
I mean, it's remarkable.
No question.
And so I look at something like the 400th anniversary of Connecticut coming up.
But we sure hope we don't have to wait that long to start this.
But things take time.
Yeah.
Right? And I wish we could get them done quickly. But when you talk about filling some of those niches on the Capitol, those spots, what if we started organizing people and we worked towards that 400th anniversary and said to each of the counties in the state, we want you to determine who should be the person that represents your county. And maybe that will be somebody like Pennington or Amos Beeman, right? Or Native Americans, Uncas, or others who bring more. I don't want to even use the word diversity with this. I want to talk about inclusion, right? Yeah. About bringing other people into the state's story, right? That have always been a part of the state's story, but have been excluded. So let's talk about the opposite of exclusion and talk about inclusion. Right? So maybe that's one way to do it. And then the other question that I have is, why do you think Hartford has done so poorly in latching on to and gathering a command of promoting its own history?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last question.
Why do you think Hartford has done such a poor job of latching onto and getting a command of its own history in terms of tourism?
I don't know. I've been struggling with this for 41 years, and I don't know. I felt fortunate when I started here, and it's analogous to what you're talking about. I was hired in 1980 at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and within a year of my arrival, I realized that the 350th was coming up in '85, and it changed my life in many ways. I pitched this idea to the director. I said, we should do a big 350th exhibition about, as it turned out, about the Connecticut Valley, not just all of Connecticut, because and he loved the idea, and by the grace of God, we raised the money from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Henry Luce Fund, and Travelers Insurance Company. It was an expensive exhibit, biggest exhibit ever mounted at the Athenaeum, but we got it done, and timing was mattered because we proposed this in '81, and the anniversary was '85, and so there you have it. That was pretty. It was pretty. Yeah. And I had raised the money to hire a full-time assistant, which was miraculous. But yes, and in those days I was young, I wasn't married. 80-hour weeks just weren't a problem. It's what I did. I mean, it's crazy. I couldn't do it now, but I spent all my weekends doing field research in graveyards and architecture because the museums were closed. I mean, it's nuts, but I loved it, and we got it done. And I think that this would be a great thing to do, to build a more inclusive Connecticut using, and the thing I talked about last week, we don't teach history to the degree we should. We don't value it to the degree we should. I sit here, I hear, STEM. Okay, but we're still a self-governing nation. Does it matter? Does civics and historical consciousness matter in a place that's supposed to govern itself? Well, I think there are people that don't really think it does matter, but I do, and I'm sure you do, and it does. And so we ought to ramp up. In Texas, they learn about American history after they're done teaching Texas history, and I'm not saying it should be that lopsided, but we are sitting on this wealth of opportunity to teach history using real things. And you and Fiona and others, Jeff, deal with students all the time. And so I'm just guessing, but my guess is that when a student can learn by touching and feeling and looking at things that are real and in the presence of their world, that it sinks in better. I don't know. It doesn't have to be all of it, but anyway, what were you going to say? No. Yeah.
Bill,
Yes.
you keep trying to sign off of this series, right? And say you're going to exit the stage for the new
I'm
generation.
not leaving the state, but yes.
The stage.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
keep saying that you're going to leave the stage and you're going to hand it off to other scholars and younger scholars.
Yes.
So I have a challenge for you before you do that, whenever that is. Can you take that enthusiasm, that passion, that research, that 40 years of experience and put it into, I don't know, maybe it'll be your farewell presentation, right? Where you show us what that inclusive history looks like, because you're talking to we're a captive audience. We're here because we want to hear what you have
Thank
to
you,
say. We're
yeah.
here because we agree with most of what you have to say about promoting Hartford history. But there's lots of folks. Since George Floyd died, I have gotten a new job in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's annoying. I keep wanting to say to folks, do you guys not know any other Black women? Like, I check so many categories, it's infuriating, and I don't want people to contact me anymore about DEI. I want them to do the work
Themselves, yeah.
themselves.
Yeah, no.
And as the biggest promoter of Hartford history, I actually think you can play a role in showing us what that can look like. I'm going to be up here next week. You've invited me into this space.
And thrilled to have you.
But let's say I'm 3-4 years into this research. You're 40 years into this research. So show us, model for us what that passion and that enthusiasm looks like.
Well, look,
when you're using this wider lens.
One of the things Jeff and Sally Whipple and I here have talked about, hopefully we'll still have energy when this is over, but we are hoping as early as December for the first time ever, to convene, and anybody with recommendations who is interested, but to convene a little meeting, it could even be a Zoom, where we, if we could find 10 people engaged in this stuff who would talk about how do we build a movement, and how do we get more people involved in doing scholarship. And my friend Gene Leach, who long now, he's probably 80 at this point, but he retired from Trinity College for decades. He had students doing Hartford history projects. Is there anyone at Trinity or even UConn that actually does that today? Admittedly, I mean, he was in Hartford, the students were here, so the Hartford stuff. And we, of course, I said last week, the research libraries are just staggering here. So it's not like it's that difficult. Plus, so much stuff is online. And, if I were the president of UConn, I would make it my purpose the next time there was an opening in the history faculty to hire somebody who took state and local seriously. Walter Woodward's been great. You're doing a great job. I've been here 40 years. I can count on 3 fingers the number of academics at the state university that were interested in any of this stuff. And I had one friend I won't name, you'd know, who kept writing books about Massachusetts, like they don't have enough help already. Give me a break. Anyway, glad I made you laugh. Yeah.
Bill, sorry, what is the process that might have to be done to get a statue up in one of those niches? Would it have to be approved by the state legislature or what?
It would probably start with a legislator writing a bill. And it's amazing. Every year, there are hundreds of bills that never get out of committee and never get voted on. But it starts a single legislator who really got it or even watched the video of this afterwards could say, I want to be that person. And if they framed it, I mean, I've been working for 3 years and I'm probably too tired at this point. We're trying to get this industrial history trail created so that people could see some of these places like Belleville, which if you've never been to Belleville, go. God, I get emotional. It is so beautiful. And Yantic, go. These are places where epic things happen, but they're places that have died to some degree. But this thing has been in committee. There's a bill. It came up. It wasn't anyway. 3 years now. It's come up, but it hasn't gotten through. I don't know. Matt's been political.
You don't actually need a legislator.
Really?
It doesn't have to go through a bill. It doesn't have to become law. When the Civil War Commemoration Commission sought to put the forlorn soldier into the Capitol, inside the Capitol building.
Yeah, I just saw it. Yeah.
We had to get legislative management. So the senior management of the legislature, which included the leader of the House, the leader of the Senate, they had to sign off on it. And then we had to get approval from the Capitol Preservation and Restoration Commission. Those were the two main bodies that dealt with that. And because we had funding to do the Forlorn Soldier project, which was about a $30,000 project for both the conservation of the statue,
okay.
The statue didn't cost anything because it was donated by Peter Kelly's family.
Yeah.
And then we had it conserved. We had specialty movers bring it into the Capitol building. My daughter Emma, who at the time was, I think, 12, is literally the only kid in the state of Connecticut who was there to watch it get moved in.
Yeah.
And we always laughed at the time. And I said, you're going to remember this. You're going to come back here when you have kids at some point, and you're going to see this statue, and you're going to go, I was there.
Yeah, that's
so
cool.
We had that whole thing moved in. And so it's the big factor would be the funding component.
Yeah.
With who pays for the statue to be created. But this in itself is a wonderful opportunity for civic engagement and for the development of history and for pride in communities. And you could have, there's so many ways you can do it. And this is the thing that historians, you've been very good at this, but most, and particularly academic historians, aren't good at this. They're really good at doing their research and writing their stuff and giving talks, but they're not very good at marketing.
Yeah, right.
They're not very good at being public facing.
Right.
And you need a little bit of both of those kinds of skills to make these kinds of projects work.
No, and really, if you were talking about, there are like 7 of these spandrels that are completely, to get the scaffolding up, to design it, to carve it, that's expensive. And if there was a big project where we could actually come to a consensus about 5, even 10 elements, that's $1 million project easy. And that's not, somebody, I know, isn't that amazing?
So kids around the state donated change to have that Queen's Spanrels statue done in this area.
No, and I, reading about that Battle of Mobile Bay and how they passed the hat with school kids. It just makes you weep thinking that we had a world once where school kids understood somehow that this was important enough to not to have to put their milk money a little bit, pennies. And there've been a few incidents like that. It's what makes the world a better place. And I would love to see something happen, but I'm probably too old and tired to lead it. I don't know.
Well, speaking of tired, I think we might be ready to call it a night. And I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. And thank you, Bill. Let's give Bill a hand. And for that rich conversation. We hope to see you next week when Dr. Vernal will be speaking.